So this is my reading, reflection, and commentary on chapter 29 of the Proverbs. It happens to be a Friday evening at the time of recording. A rather strange week. A week that was filled with this battle between stagnation, complacency, and productivity and industriousness. In some sense, my experience has always sort of been this undulating thing. It can be quite difficult at times to get the dials turned right, but life isn't meant to be easy. There are meant to be things that are difficult, that cause us to pause, or causes us to retreat, to flee into some place of comfort, so that we don't have to express ourselves or express any sort of meaning into the world. And this posture of mind is unfortunate. It is something that I think should be avoided. And so I mention this because the experience here with the Proverbs is meant to provide a productive outlet for those who may listen, for those who may engage with the Proverbs. And this is my way of engaging with the Proverbs, engaging with the religious life or tradition. So usually I start these episodes out, at least for the past couple I have, with a prayer, and each episode is comprised of multiple days, sort of sewn together. And so there will be multiple prayers throughout. But this is the first one of this episode, so dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here. I thank you that I can have this time to sit down and to reflect. This time serves as a stop in the door that would otherwise close on my mind, as I mentioned a moment ago about that absent existence, the passive existence. And as I sit here, I know that I must think about something that is meaningful. I must do something productive with my mind. And for all of the drudgery that comes from the day-to-day, and for all of my confusion at times, where I wish that I could just do what was straightforward to my mind, to sit and to think about something as it comes, without the hustle, without the rapidity of experience and of life, then things would be so much simpler, easier. But I think, in a way, although the ideal for us is difficult to find, and while I don't necessarily mean by simple or easy something that is passive and lethargic, but rather something that fits well. It is a congruent experience where my relationship to you is something that is not a telephone call away, not a prayer away, but an intimate awareness of always being together, of always understanding each other's presence. And for this, I find myself in a bit of wondering, a bit of melancholy perhaps, at the one that I see behind the veil, the one that I can focus my attention on, the one that has placed threads throughout all things. But at times I long for more than just threads, but a direct hand. I pray that this podcast, this reflection on the Proverbs, is something that can sharpen this relationship between you and I. That I can find that hand, or a series of threads that I can add to those that I've already collected. And in time, hopefully I can have this cloth that covers me, this spiritual cloth, woven as a part of me. And with this I pray, in Jesus' name, amen. So, I believe I'm on verse 16, again of chapter 29 of the Proverbs. So let's continue. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increases, but the righteous shall see their fall. So let's think about this experience of the wicked multiplying. Sometimes I find it difficult to know exactly where to start these things. And the way that my mind places things together, it tends to take an entish approach to things. It's quite slow. It takes its time. But it gets there all the same. And sometimes the road is difficult to take because there are many. And I think that this is where we need to begin. Because there is a certain constancy of multiplicity. That multiplicity is something fundamental to our experience. It may manifest in the things that I have just described, in the experience in which, whether it be interpreting a proverb, trying to find somewhere to eat, trying to understand what job to pick, what school to go to, trying to decide exactly how a situation ought to be handled, a professional situation, exactly what to do productively in a professional context, what types of relationships that should be made, what should be sacrificed, anything that we can think of. And when faced with multiplicity, what do we do? How do we decide? I think when we are here, we are sort of at the frontier of logic. We wish to put together some reason to do something, some reason that isn't just cold and calculated, but a reason that has meaning behind it. Now, there may be reasons that are cold and calculated, but the reasons of this sort are quite fundamental to what we believe, what we feel, but generally how we experience things. And so if we imagine ourselves in various environments, let's say that we are in the environment of chaos, of constant variability. No structure, no order. Just a never-ending series of steps that are multiplicitous and that do not have a clear end or a clear goal in mind. There may be some that live this lifestyle. It may be expressed in a many number of ways. I think most of us experience life with a combination of order or oneness, singularity, the coming to, the dawn, the morning, as in Genesis. And that of the place of mind that is more found within the indecisive, or maybe even the passive, again, to avoid the multiplicity, to avoid the chaos, to avoid the potential. Again, I think multiplicity finds itself in many facets of our experience. It is a fundamental aspect of our experience. When the wicked are multiplied. So we're talking about a state of multiplicity when the wicked are multiplied. But the environment in this context is surrounded by wicked people. And so in some way we can think about just the rough general environment as many different roads, many different potential roads leading to different places, all of which tend towards selfishness, perhaps in the ultimate end towards absence of being, but generally self-centeredness, and that focus inward on the self, and lack of the interconnectedness among things, and the sacrifice of components of selfish desire. That, of course, what is put in jeopardy here for the sake of this multiplicity of the wicked is the coming together, the oneness of the people, the common language, the common understanding, the common culture, the common ground. Thinking at that level, at the level of the multiplicity of the people, of the commons, let's say, of the society, one can see how the foundations would crumble on such a society that is so separate, that only cares about the individual nodes in the network, and the broad network is just a very loose scaffolding holding it all together. But it's easy to think in absolutes. It's easy to imagine an entire society falling into wickedness. While it may happen, it probably happens suddenly. Like a house that is built on firm foundation or weak foundations that suddenly collapses. Most people, most situations would recognize the weakness of their foundations before they collapsed. But of course this has happened throughout history. By our prudence, I think we deserve some credit that it doesn't happen every year. but every so often at different levels it does happen. And it is difficult for those who are alive and maintaining the human experience at that time. Surely things are quite chaotic and multiplicitous. But there's something a little bit more subtle that I think is worth mentioning here. And as I am fond of diving into the self, I think it's important to recognize that of these threads that are left here for us to understand and to know, that are built upon our collective experience, but also just singular experience, I think when we collect enough of them, certain pictures form. We make certain designs and certain patterns, a certain way of things, perhaps. And some conceptions may be more sophisticated than others. Some of these projects of these spiritual threads amount in false correlations. But all the same, it is difficult, I think, to understand subjective phenomena without building some of these categories for personal use. And so when I say that there are these spiritual threads, what I'm referring to is a thread that exists, or that is known, or can be known, because it lies within that spiritual domain. As a way of measuring our experience, or a way of experiencing our experience, what I call the spiritual domain is one of the fundamental ways through which we understand it. And there are these terms associated with this dimension. Again, the spiritual thread, as it is given the term wicked, is something that comes to us a rather bizarre thing, a rather thing of constancy that we can find in ourselves, just as we can find in somebody else, or as I've mentioned, of a society, of a company, of a group of friends. Wickedness is one of these spiritual threads, and it doesn't have to be good for it to be spiritual. When the wicked are multiplied. And so I think it's important to bring this up, because this frame will allow us to understand the wicked person inside of us. For how do we know something of this spiritual dimension? Unless we experience, unless we are the beings of this reality, that we are connected to something that has mind, that has this agentic quality, that affords us this experience. So today happens to be a new day, new thoughts. And so I'll begin this segment with a prayer, as is the custom. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you that throughout the day today, there have been good, attentive moments for which I can feel more present in this experience and less like it is something of a movie that I'm watching. I thank you for people that wish to do good or people that wish to be better, because I met one such person today. And as I look in the Bible in front of me, I wish that this experience, as I've mentioned on the days past, that it brings me closer to you and to that center point of attention and of experience and of the heart, and have these elements of being aligned. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increases. So we take these spiritual threads on the collective level that tend towards singularity. There is, because of such of an amplified self-centeredness, there is a separation in the collective. There's a separation of the singularness of the multitude. We've spoken of the many or of the multiple of multiplicity before as a basic principle. But seeing how multiplicity can exist within unity, I think, is a fascinating structure. And surely, since we are speaking about the collective, a strong individualization may be necessary as a protective mechanism to separate from the multiplicity that is going in a wrong direction. But also, it can be the undoing of a society, the collective death of a culture, of a civilization, when now multiplicity can no longer come into a unit. And there may be many reasons for that. Maybe the unit became diseased, like I mentioned. Or because the people lost faith and they reverted to simpler tastes and pleasures. Now, since this is in the spirit of the verse, we're talking about a situation that is fairly negative. We're talking about the wicked multiplying and transgression increasing. So we have this societal image. I think it's good to zoom in now to the individual. It's always a useful exercise to go over the effects of this wicked character that might exist within us. So part of this reflection, part of this exercise on wickedness, I think I would like to be something that tests my own understanding of wickedness as it may find itself threaded within me. It doesn't mean that I am wicked, of course. I think there are various ways of interpreting when a person crosses the threshold and can be considered wicked. Exactly what number of spiritual threads or spiritual threads of wickedness does this take? It's hard to say. Sometimes it's hard to say psychologically when somebody has crossed into the boundary of pathology, but we all know that it exists. We know it exists by its extreme versions, on its more subtler, we know that there are certain institutions that ought not to handle them, that there is something about the closeness of disposition to our souls, that it may become dangerous for a disinterested institution to find its way tinkering in the gears of that mechanism. But since it is so local, it is something that must necessarily be addressed through close and trusting teachers or partners. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increases. But on the self, I have to wonder if the principle of wickedness, or maybe I should say, I have to wonder at what level does the principle of wickedness rest? And what of the principles that support wickedness? Simpler, surely, in the spiritual sense, but is there something more fundamental that we may miss when we think about wickedness? And of course, I think that there is, just as I've mentioned about the diagnosis of pathology here. And thinking about our being, our spirit, as a number of these threads that are wound together, the movement of which is spirited by our agency, by our will. Of the small threads that we all have sprinkled here and there, I think these threads, in and of themselves, don't necessarily mean wickedness in their infancy or in their relative independence. And what I mean by that is, if wickedness is to be a concept that is more complex from simpler principles, then the simpler principles themselves don't necessarily imply wickedness. They may imply a certain directionality, but not wickedness. Just like a particular organization of proteins may be responsible for one function or another, but what is important is the structure, the way in which it's organized, the way in which things are related, because that determines their function. And as far as it relates to the self, it determines how far downstream it may go, what the effective behavior is, what the disposition of mind is. So I suppose, just thinking this through, that if there is such a thing simpler, in which I think that there is, we should explore it. But the first thing that is on that list, that to-do list, is to establish or to consider why wickedness is made of something of simpler elements, or maybe is organized in a particular way from elements that we all have. But just because we have them, it doesn't make us wicked. Now, as I think about this protein situation, I'm a bit thrown back, because my initial inclination was to say that wickedness was something of an ontology. And that maybe when I say that there is wickedness in all of us, and yet while it doesn't imply wickedness to our whole identity, that there are even more layers to this puzzle than I thought. Should it still be the case that these individual layers of wickedness within each individual is actually wickedness, or is it something more simple, which is built upon something simpler? Or maybe simple is not the right word. But regardless, when I think about the concept of an identity having components to it, and at one time or another, just thinking about my own mind as it revolves around, I'm sort of giving some artistic license here, but as my experience, my conscious experience, revolves around day to day, and I use that imagery of revolving around because I think that there are different faces that I have. There are different faces that, some faces are my intended face, the best that I can be. It is the face that I would like to have all of the time. But unfortunately, as this rotating sphere of self turns, I find aspects of myself that I know I need to change and to improve. And there's an awareness out of all of these phases of the potential of self. There's an awareness of knowing that when the sphere comes back around to that goodness and that period of life that is spiritually satisfying, and of course a lot of this has to do with my own faithfulness and my ability to stay attentive and to be in the game, as it were. As I find myself in periods of weakness where I'm not on it, and I find perhaps those dispositions in those darkened caves of mind that I would recognize as the wickedness within all of us. It is here that I think that we must start. We must look around in our experience. And so I wonder about this relative experience. I wonder about, as I think about my mind in the illustration just laid out, of all of these slivers to this sphere as it turns, as goodness fades into something that I might recognize as lethargy, something that one of these cardinal sins that I recognize about myself. And although it doesn't happen all of the time, it happens more than I wish it would. That what I take for rest is actually something that is unproductive. And that rest and leisure ought to be something that, while may not add to the perpetual exhaustion of mind, still requires something of mind. And as long as there is this ease of expression, in spite of potential psychological fatigue, it is worthwhile. But getting back into this cave that I'm imagining, I almost feel like I'm looking at a map of self, for which there are some beautiful landscapes. There are some that are passive and boring, and there's some that are dark and interesting because of their darkness. And so it was that darkness where that spirit of wickedness flirts with the whole of us, that tempts our attention to it. And now that I'm speaking about it, I have to wonder, is just the idea of reflecting on one's own wickedness something that is giving into this experience? Am I actually being this way? Or am I truly, as I imagine myself almost as an observer of self, that I'm trying to see it to understand it so I can move past it? And I suppose the potential for these two outcomes or experiences to be had is probable. But it is not because of the risk of the former that we should sacrifice what benefit may come from recognizing within ourselves things that we ought to transcend. I've often thought about transgression. For whatever reason, in this geographical landscape in the desert, for which there is either a cliff or a strong demarcation between the lighted part of the desert and then this sort of darkened or shadowed part of the desert. And there's a clear, like I said, demarcation between the two. And the crossing of that demarcation is the transgression. But within our experience, a transgression does not hold the same weight at all levels. It may be related to different levels, but I think a transgression can be quite sophisticated. Just as much as our relationships are between other people, other objects, to the environment generally, there's a lot of interaction and exchange of information. And a transgression in one domain or one context may or may not apply to the next. It is almost like thinking about, it is like thinking about this idea of interwovenness, interwovenness of information. And as we scale basic information up to spiritual information, we can identify these threads that may cause a transgression, like the propensity towards wickedness. But being down in this cave and identifying those passive moments, at least in my experience, are those moments of multiplicity for the sake of multiplicity, of argumentation for the sake of argumentation, anything that disrupts or perverts the attention away from goodness. Goodness itself, I think, is another topic. It is a large topic with many different approaches and subtleties. But one thing is for certain, I know that if I have some goal that I need to accomplish, that there is some good outside of basic, let's say, work requirements. I know that there is some broader purpose for life, and there is a responsibility that all of us have to fulfill our purpose. Some of us will move closer to those ends than others, some by circumstance and some by force of will, or a combination of the two. But one thing is certain, is that if this wickedness within the cave is allowed to proliferate, and those threads innervate more and more deeply into the primary driver and the end of attention, there is no doubt and there's no wonder why transgressions will increase. The mind is not focused. Our passions, our basic passions, will be our primary drivers. We will submit to them rather than in the Humean perspective. Take a hold of our taste. And maybe I should explain what this means. I was reading an essay earlier today by David Hume, and he was talking about the differences between the desire for taste and for passion. And actually, let me grab the book that I was reading really quick and open it up here so I can explain exactly the terminology that he used. So the title of the essay is Of the Delicacy of Taste and Passion. He says, some people are subject to a certain delicacy of passion, which makes them extremely sensible to all the accidents of life, and gives them a lively joy upon every prosperous event, as well as a piercing grief, when they meet with misfortune and adversity. And he contrasts this with the delicacy of taste. There is a delicacy of taste observable in some men, which very much resembles this delicacy of passion, and produces the same sensibility to beauty and deformity of every kind, as that does to prosperity and adversity, obligations and injuries. When you present a poem or a picture to a man possessed of this talent, the delicacy of his feeling makes him be sensibly touched with every part of it. Nor are the masterly strokes perceived with more exquisite relish and satisfaction than the negligences or absurdities with disgust and uneasiness. So his main argument is that the tastes, rather than the passions, ought to be primary. That the passions are those things that lead a man into these broad, wide, violent swings of emotion and of behavior. And it is not as though the passions are a negative in this essay, but rather they submit to the delicacy of taste. And it is maximizing our awareness, essentially, of that which is beautiful and that which is good, that allows us to control our passions, or to augment our passions. So, for example, I had an experience in life, a broad experience in life, where when I was younger I didn't read much. My family and my parents were often very busy, and discipline fell short on me as a child. I was quite a lazy child, and because of the lack of external discipline, in addition to my own laziness, there was this sort of vacuum of wanted learning. I remember that there was a lot of video games and a lot of watching of television. A perfect substrate for ruining a child's mind. But again, this is a lazy child that we're speaking about here. But as I got older, and as I made my way rather ignorantly through life, I eventually came to the understanding that learning is a good thing, and that learning new skills and being able to do things productively in the world is a good thing. It is something that provides us with meaning and purpose, provides me with meaning and purpose. And also eventually I understood the value of learning and of reading. But it wasn't really until I thought to myself about the nature of these tastes, in some sense. I didn't use those words, but after reading the essay there was some mighty parallels, but also reminders to continue to advance the taste and to suppress the passions. And I have noticed that as the taste for meaningful things develops, the more superficial behaviors begin to subside, but not totally. The passions that remain are more of the sort that relieve the mind of pressure, relieve the mind of stress. As anything, I think, that involves the mind in learning will be stressful. It should be. Doesn't mean it won't be satisfying, but it will be stressful to the mind. There must be some exertion of energy. And given enough of that, there is this delicacy of passion, I think, that begins to brew. Now, I've said this many times over. I've said this already in this episode, but in different terms now, this brewing of the delicacy of passions is a dangerous thing in the face of fatigue, in the face of stress, and that built-up pressure, spiritual pressure, that needs to be relieved. Because it's quite easy to relieve, or to think that one relieves it, in those delicacy, or those delicate passions. Those simple and base emotions. But that brings us to wickedness, given enough of it. The addictive personality knows this intuitively. But the righteous shall see their fall. Much like this wicked disposition, we also possess that righteous disposition. We can occupy either face whenever we please. But as a matter of experience, it is quite difficult at times to throw off the wicked mask and to accept that righteous one. But no doubt truth and honesty, regardless of how we feel, will cause us to be able to see how a certain type of behavior will lead to a negative outcome. Correct your son, and he shall give you rest. Yeah, he shall give delight unto your soul. So there are many verses here in the Proverbs that surround this topic. There's one in this chapter that we have just gone over. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. There's another that comes to mind. I don't remember what chapter it's in, but something to the effect of, spare the rod, ruin the child. Correct your son, and he shall give you rest. He shall give you delight to your soul. So although this is a straightforward verse, I think understanding how not correcting a child may lead to further negative behavior, and that further negative behavior will come back to reflect on us. Because we are responsible, we have to deal with the outcomes of this poor behavior. Understanding this, I think, is important. But like with all matters of understanding, there are levels to this. There are different ways that we can incorporate this into mind, into memory. And so I think this is a good opportunity to talk about discipline. Both in the sense of correction, but also in the sense of routine, regularity, of sacrifice of short-term pleasure for long-term gain. Both of these are important. For within the correction, there are many things that we can consider. I think correction in large part depends on the problem. It depends on the incorrectness and the degree of incorrectness. If there's some mechanical problem that we come across, some mechanical deficiency, the degree to which we have to work to solve the problem not only depends on our understanding of the mechanics. Let's say it's a part of the car, so there's a mechanical prerequisite understanding for the car, but then also the complexity of the problem, which is inherent regardless of the knowledge of the individual. And so problems of mind, I think, follow a similar pursuit, or a similar logic. And as far as I'm concerned, reflecting on simple and straightforward problems doesn't quite satisfy. And so when I think about correcting your son, correcting my son, although I think the simple is related to the complex, and that it is important to correct a simple problem, a problem of manners, a problem of discipline as it relates to a particular chore, but of more complex behavior, I find it to be more interesting. And I have to wonder, at what these situations arise out of. Surely some may arise out of a failure on my part to correct the child. Small series of corrections, I think, can be said to prevent larger corrections later on in life. This is the purpose of the verse, after all. But inevitably there will be problems in life that arise that may not be directly related to parenting. Problems of the external environment, the environment outside of the house. And when these issues are brought home, dealing with them, I find these interesting. I find the mechanics of these problems interesting. And also, I'll say that it may not necessarily have to do with an external environment. It could just be a complicated problem that arises within a developing mind. And so, assuming that there is this productive relationship between the Father and the Son, there is a large affordance. That landscape there is quite fertile to plant and to move things around and to build things. Shared attention is ample. So let's consider the word discipline. And let's consider the etymological roots of this word. From Latin, we have discipulus, meaning student, learner, or follower. We have the word disciplina, meaning instruction, teaching, training, or a system of knowledge. We have discere, a verb meaning to learn. Now, from the Old French and Middle English influence, as the Latin entered into Old French, we have discipline, meaning instruction and knowledge. As this entered into Middle English, we have the word discipline, and that maintained its meaning of training, instruction, and punishment for correction. In early Christianity, discipline was related to discipleship, the practice of following a teacher in Christ. In the Middle Ages, there was more of a focus on the enforcement or correction. And of course, in contemporary usages, we have discipline referring to self-control and order, a field of study, an academic discipline, and punishment for correction. Correct your son, and he shall give you rest. Now, what I'd like to do here is to weave in discipline under this idea of correction. And given what we had mentioned about this, the importance of this relationship, affording us this fertile environment that we can develop discipline in terms of the teacher-student type relationship, that the father gives advice, teaching to the son that the son will follow, but also sort of a productive reproof, a productive discipline, so that the child, the son, comes back to understanding that they are using a system that is afforded by this productive environment of the relationship that will lead to their transformation and understanding. And again, to do this, I want to focus on the roots of this word, discipline, of teaching. So today is a new day. And like always, a new day brings new thoughts. And so I'd like to begin this new day with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you for my friends. I thank you for my family. I thank you that I can take the opportunity to reflect and to go over those details of the day that may only come to me in my hour of fatigue and of self-doubt, and that rather than meet these things with a head hung low, I can keep my head up high and be satisfied in the fact that I'm able to see where my mistakes lie and correct them. I thank you for the day ahead and the challenges that it may bring. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So, as I was discussing yesterday, I left off about thinking about the correction of the sun. Diving into this a little bit more, the first thing that I thought of listening to the tail end of the recording yesterday was of the importance of the relationship. And in the contemporary intellectual circles, there is this trending, maybe, idea that parents should not be friends to their children. And it's not to say that they ought not to be kind or relatable to their children, but rather that there is a strong positional difference between the two. Of course, this is obvious to some degree, but also I think that there is a degree in which this separation of position and of authority can be quite subtle. And so when I think about this relationship, about correcting the sun, I think about, as the Latin root suggests, a student or a learner, a follower. And while there are many ways of teaching, there is always that relationship of superior and subordinate. That there is something about the subordinate that they must submit to their superior. And within this relationship, there is a particular type of environment. An environment, if facilitated, has this rich territory for the learner, and for the teacher, of course. And this environment has within it a series of affordances. There are certain absolutes that the teacher knows and must pass on to the student or the child, the son. And there are certain, I think, limitations on the type of reciprocation. Again, this relationship has to be of a teacher and a learner. It is not learner to learner. And so although the type of reciprocal information exchange that occurs between friends does not exist between the father and the son, it does, however, exist on a different scale. And I think the reciprocation of this information can not only benefit the learner, but also the teacher. The teacher also learns things about what they don't understand by teaching. And in so doing, there is this process that occurs that is facilitated by that fruitful environment of the learner, of one that needs to know, or that one that will come to know something. And that process of coming to a mutual understanding, or of bringing a learner to a point of mutual understanding, bringing the learner up to a certain standard that the teacher possesses in knowledge, is cause for relief. It is cause for celebration, perhaps. It is cause for praise. in the sense that what has been accomplished is a type of maturation. What has been accomplished is the improvement of agency, the improvement of alignment to God, we could say, alignment to goodness, the expansion of the taste, the submission of the passions, the peace of mind, knowing that the Son has come to submit to righteous order. And I think, in my mind, I'm quick to think about the rod, this sort of executive function, or maybe I shouldn't say executive function, but executive in the sense that there is the actionable component of the legislative body. It is the police force of the symbolic domain, the enforcer, such that the law does not need to be explained to some. Some people are just ignorant of it, and they have to submit regardless of that, the importance of transformation and of understanding. The rod certainly has its usefulness, but here we're thinking about something a little bit more subtle, and a relationship as fundamental as that between the parent and an offspring surely should be of the finer and more delicate sort. But surely not to spare the rod in all cases, of course. Correct your son, and he shall give you rest. He shall give delight to your soul. So I think there's a few things that can be said here. I think we've established sufficiently what it means to correct the son, how it would necessarily give us peace, what type of environment we would find ourselves in to go about creating that situation or that experience. But now we are dealing with the effects, sort of second order effects of this process. So I think we have to do a couple things. One is to understand a little bit even more about the process, because in so doing we will understand its effects. But perhaps by understanding its effects, we will understand more about the process. And any time the soul is mentioned, there's something quite special about the opportunity that we have to reflect on it. The soul being one of the principal items, the principal terms for the value of a human life and of the human experience. The soul is something that I've gone around many times, and each time I think about the soul, I think about something a little bit different. But to me, the soul is as much a part of us, almost like a body, as it is a place of meeting, a place of exchange. It is something that is so fundamental to us, but yet it is something that is so intimately connected to something that is outside of us. So it makes it unique. It makes it the living thing, the living aspect of mind, independent of its material causes. It is the thing of mind that mind considers when it thinks about its own value. It is the thing that exists not independent of all other things, but strongly related to all other things. But perhaps more importantly, more specifically, it is of a type of organization, a type of experience, a type of relating, type of orienting. There's an image in my mind that is much more descriptive, I think, than what I'm saying. So let me crawl. Let me revert to an infant state here. Use quite basic words and then build my way up. I think about the term above. What is above? I think about things that are below. I think about things that don't have agency, that don't have conscious experience. I think about basic material, basic matter. I think about these things by themselves. As a snapshot, they don't necessarily mean much. Their interactions in the whole, I'm sure, do at some level. Impossible for me to say. But I think also of awareness. And I think about being, and this is where I think about aboveness. And I think about purity, the higher we climb. That which we surrender is uncertainty. The uncertainty in the procedure, in the process. Because it's not just uncertainty when things dissolve and dissociate. For things that move out into multiplicity are a part of the experience. And coming back together into some unity is also part of the experience. I think about our experience at the level that it is, compared to the understanding of this whole thing that we call reality. And while there are various tools and psychological mappings that allow us to consider it in greater and greater detail, or at least give us some framework to conceptualize it, regardless of what we use, I think there are many ways to get there, to consider this experience. Consider, for a moment, the result of a graduated expanse of human experience, whether that be through expanding their own consciousness through theological developments or technological developments that then spur theological developments that perhaps even augment man's own experience through artificial intelligence, perhaps. Thinking about a reality that is so close, so proximal to our experience, I think is easier, at least affords us. It makes easier the thought of imagining what being is, what the soul is, as it seems to me that one individual soul is a part of this multiplicitous process by which we are slowly, and at least by the individual's perspective, painfully coming back together to some whole, or at least we try to, if we are faithful. And how the whole thing plays out, again, I am uncertain. But I am certain that something is playing out. I am certain that behind my mind, when I surrender enough of those temporalities. And actually, I like to pull up a quote here. There's another essay I was reading from David Hume. It might take me a moment to find it, but although it's simple, there's something about it that this really struck me. It probably strikes everybody that spends their days working. So this is a quote from one of David Hume's essays titled The Delicacy of Taste. Nothing is so improving to the temper as the study of the beauties, either of poetry, eloquence, music, or painting. They give a certain elegance of sentiment to which the rest of mankind are strangers. The emotions which they excite are soft and tender. They draw off the mind from the hurry of business and interest, cherish reflection, dispose to tranquillity, and produce an agreeable melancholy, which, of all dispositions of the mind, is the best suited to love and friendships. There's something to that, especially that point about taking us away from the hurry of business and interest. I know that I all too often find myself ingrained in, sort of almost lost in, and I constantly have to remind myself, as one may understand at this point through the various prayers that I am putting forth, that what I have to remind myself is continually to be thankful that there is an experience that I can have that is outside of that, outside of the hurry and that interest. Because there's a certain amount of it that is just distracting to things that are true value. He shall give delight to your soul. Now, the interesting thing here is that as we were talking about the relationship between the parent and the son, that although it occupies this posture of an authority figure and a subordinate, a teacher and a learner, there is a type of reciprocation. And especially given that this is a sacred relationship, the environment that it necessarily produces, if it is facilitated, is also sacred. And by these sacred environments, we find ourselves in that profoundly spiritual domain. We find ourselves religiously bound by our words and that experience. And it is by this that the soul, as this conduit to the divine, expands, almost like a portal. It opens, and the volume of information that we can perceive and see from that divine experience permeates us that much more. And I think it is by this experience that the soul is brought to delight. That the delight is not just the relationship between the son and the parent, but the parent and the son to God. There's this three-piece unfolding that takes place. Where there is no vision, the people perish. But he that keeps the law, happy is he. So before we begin this next verse, today happens to be a new day. So I'd like to open with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you for my friends. I thank you for their growth. I thank you that I can to have them in my life. There's a desire that I have to nurture these relationships, to not let them stagnate. And I thank you that I can connect with them. And if I have troubles, or if they have troubles, there is some place to go. There's confidence in both parties. And I pray that this reflection on this new verse is something that is productive, expansive. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So again, this verse, where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keeps the law, happy is he. So I want to begin by talking about this vision, how we can conceptualize it. In some sense, as with many things that we've discussed, the vision has to do with attention. The vision, it calls to our mind, it calls to our attention an image or an experience that we know all too well. That visual apparatus that provides us with so much vivid detail about our environment. I think we are asked to reflect on the graduated or the higher level version of this sensory apparatus. And what I mean by that is, as we think about vision in the graduated sense, vision in mind, it is something that includes sensory information from the environment, surely, but also many layers, complicated layers of this sensory data, of information of other people, other organizations, institutions within a society. And I think depending on the person, depending on their position, depending on their understanding and awareness, this vision will appear differently. But I think interestingly, on a societal level, we all have a degree of a shared vision. Now, in cases where there's a tumultuous environment, let's say contemporary America, there may be this splintered vision, but generally there are threads through which we can trace threads of commonality that we can trace through each and every citizen, or at least most citizens. And I think we can expand that out, and we can think about differing factions among the citizens, about their beliefs in the governance of their society, and how they believe, how they understand their society to be moving and to be progressing. I think there are many things also that contribute to this vision. not the least of which is those who hold a position of a significant authority. And when I read that verse the first time, probably because I'm so used to seeing reference to the monarch, the king, that I was considering this type of structure. If the king lacks the vision, then surely the people do not have the same vision. They are as equally lost in that the unfortunate character traits of the king, whether it be licentiousness, lethargy, whatever. There's an important distinction or parallel that we need to draw here. There's a thread between vision and the people perishing. And the words spoken so far have not really drawn a clear path to how that is possible. I mentioned that given a weak vision or an unstable vision, the people will be lost. They will not necessarily have the necessary motivations, the cultural underpinnings which provide them with a certain fortitude to make it through life and to prosper in life. Now here, I suppose, to a degree, we can see how this might lead to something like a perishing. But I think there's something more fundamental about the importance of this vision that I have yet to get to. So let's think about this. Where there is no vision, one thing that comes to mind that I find interesting is the relationship between what we can call mind and what is, I want to say physical, but these distinctions are a bit basic and they don't satisfy very much. We have such a distinction between the physical and the conscious life, but there are obvious connections between the two. It is just so that with life, and more specifically with the human experience, that there is such a drastic difference between the agent of mind and, let's say, the agent of a tree, or a leaf, or a bacterium, or even simpler, we can think about an atom. That, in its own way, has its own type of agency. It is a thing that can be identified, that has certain behaviors, certain qualities, and we could say at some level perhaps motivations, although this word is quite apt to be applied to life forms, to living things, biological things. Now, I don't necessarily wish to draw a strong conclusion between the most basic of material, inanimate material, and of the most agentic. But I do wish for a moment to reflect on how it is that what we think about, the broad vision that we have for ourselves, for our collectives, how this can lead not only to amazing successes and joys, but also the most painful deaths and human tragedies. And of course, all of this plays out in the physical domain. As we make our mistakes in vision, as we find ourselves in that mode of perishing, the body will decay. It will be consumed by the earth. And in this way, perhaps it's just me, but I feel that I feel that looking at vision in this way, especially after the ending of some experience, it highlights maybe the importance. It highlights, the importance of vision, the reality of vision, the concreteness of vision. If we take for a moment the blind eye, let's say in a physical sense, somebody that is physically blind, what can we say of their experience? Well, we can say that they are unable to see. They are unable to use that organ to take in that information from the environment. And so they rely on other aspects of information from the environment to fill in their understanding of the world. Much inhibited, of course, by the lack of that perceptive ability, but also uniquely adaptable to take in more sensitive, or to be more sensitive to information by other means, through other organs. But if all that there was of our perception, vision, then we find ourselves in such a lonely state of existence. In fact, it would have to be the case that some vision would have to be a prerequisite. Otherwise, the mind would not develop. Information is required to establish the agent, I think. At a certain point, the agent can survive, I think, a little while without additional information once he has matured. But if the vision, let's say, is suddenly cut off in adulthood, under this hypothetical example of the human being only having one perceptual organ, that of sight, the denial of such a thing would cause him to move so far into the self and to find meaning, to find that vision of where he is, of what he is doing, but of course, that lack of reciprocal exchange of information means that he is lost. He is lost in the darkness. It is as dark in his mind as it is his absence of sight in the physical sense. And the effects of such a thing surely it doesn't take much to imagine that this person will not live long. If they are unable to understand and navigate their environment, they are unable to find sustenance for themselves. Mentally, they are unable to recognize their own deceit. I suppose they have their soul intact. And the conscious experience, I think, does afford a view into this reality. But such a strong disconnect from our reality, our material reality, will surely cause him to perish. But of course, there's a way that we have yet to describe, a way of mind that we have yet to describe, that I think is more central to what we are speaking about here. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And part of the problem with grasping such a large image such as this is of the many potential situations that may arise from a lack of vision. Where lack of vision may in some sense lead to famine, poor economic decisions can lead to the impoverishment of a society. And I can't help but to think that this experience is antithetical to wisdom. For instead of the mind expanding its understanding, its awareness of the relatedness among things, the awareness of the relatedness among things is cut in every domain, such that this vision, this understanding, reduces. And what increases is singularity and also multiplicity. Singularity of self, but multiplicity of selves, disconnected from other selves. And given this lack of cohesive interaction among people that are so necessary for the survival of the people at that level, the lack of such organization leads to its decay. But he that keeps the law, happy is he. Now there is an implication that keeping the law would prevent against this perishing. Now, we have explicitly the statement, happy is he. But it is an interesting matter to reflect on law as a type of security of organization, enforcement of a certain way of things, a certain order. And by this order, by the structure, it is like the glue that prevents that experience of centralization of self and the destruction of the singularity of the collective, or shared understanding, shared beliefs, shared ethics, shared institutions, shared belief. The law, although imperfect surely, prevents against the extremes of such a state of destitution. A servant will not be corrected by words, for though he understands, he will not answer. Now this character of the servant, this is not somebody that is mentioned often in the Proverbs. I think the servant is mentioned 6 times from the source that I'm looking at here, a quick search on ChatGPT. Chapter 11, verse 29, chapter 12, verse 9, chapter 14, verse 35, chapter 17, verse 2, chapter 29, verse 19, which we are on now, and then chapter 30, verse 22, comprise the totality of this character of the servant. A servant will not be corrected by words. So the first thing that we have to do here is to understand the role of the servant, what position they hold, perhaps how their mind is oriented given that position. So in order to do this, we go back to the period of the 10th to 6th centuries BCE. And we think about the role of the servant during this period. And what I have come to understand is that the servant did not occupy one particular role, but many. That the servant was almost like a class of people. They are the ones that serve. So among this servant class, we have what I think is traditionally associated with the servant, that of the household servant, the ones that perform domestic duties like cooking and cleaning, caring for the livestock, attending to their master's needs. Some of these people had more responsibility, some had less. Some managed household affairs. We have the laborers and field workers, something that we would probably also associate with a servant or a slave, working in agriculture, harvesting crops, tending again to animals. Some of these people were, as in Exodus, bond servants due to debts that couldn't be paid for those 6 or 7 years. And so in order to pay off their debt, they worked for that time. There were the royal and government servants, held high positions in the king's court, such as cupbearers or advisors. We see this in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11. In Proverbs 14:35, we have an indication the king's favor is towards a wise servant, that in the king's household, among his retinue, there are these underlings that may possess significant authority. I almost think like in many cultures, like in Persia and in China, the eunuchs that were part of the palace population that held high government offices. Apprentices and disciples, that's another category of servant. And in this situation, they were more students than anything. And then there was the class of servitude that was the slave. And I think bondservants would also be put into that category. Indentured servant. And although the way of society in the contemporary era has changed a little bit, I have to agree with Aristotle when he says that there will always be slaves. This slave class, or the servants, will always exist in some capacity. And while, again, although our societies are different, they are structured differently, we still have this servant class of people. And in fact, given the division of labor, I think we have sort of, in a way, expanded out this servant class. We have many jobs for which people serve each other. We can think about it in the sense that we all provide some sort of service, but also we can think about it more characteristically, like a server at a restaurant, or again, a domestic servant, somebody that cleans the house. In a broader sense, the concept of serving, while although it gets away, I think, a little bit from the trope, if we will, of the servant that occupies that particular position of servitude, of having little agency relative to the person that they serve, unlike in our situation, in our society. Although that type of relationship still exists, among certain households. Our serving relationship is more mutual, that it doesn't have this strong differential. But be that as it may, as we think about our society, the way that we organize ourselves, we can still find the thread of that servant throughout our day-to-day, throughout our experience. And I think about in my own experience, in my own life, the ways in which I occupy this trope. And I have a subordinate relationship, of course, to my superiors at work, within that corporate body. And there are people that are beneath me in that structure. But as I think about this correction that we just finished talking about 2 verses ago, correcting the son, and exactly what goes into correction, that it, as this verse implies, it reinforces that correction is often not just about words, although words are quite important. We brought up the idea of the rod, that executive punishment, being an aspect or a quality of understanding and submitting one to a particular way of things, to a particular order. For though he understands, he will not answer. An interesting statement, somewhat puzzling. I think we can easily see that by words, by just pure explanation, correcting somebody may have a limiting effect. Only so much information will be brought into the system and retained. There's a certain degree of relevance that I think is important here. But the second part of this verse is pointing to something I think a little bit more. This difference between understanding and answering. For what necessarily does it mean for somebody that is in this position to be corrected? Why would they need to answer? We answer in response to questions. A question may be a task designed to reinforce a particular teaching, and if one is unable to answer the question, then that teaching has gone on deaf ears. The words have failed. And yet, the servant understands. So it would seem that at some level the mind can reason and can perfectly see the correction. But there's a level in which the answer rests more fundamentally, that it is immediately graspable by the mind, that it is something that is retained in memory that can be brought forward. So to reiterate, that correction, as we've spoken of, is an intricate experience. It is something that I think differs person to person. When I say differs, I mean that the way in which a person is brought to a particular truth, that they are truly correcting some fault, that although there may be some constancies for which people learn and retain information, motivations and incentives, I think, can often be integrated at different levels or strengths. And certain people respond well to certain types of experiences versus others. Now, that's one path of reflection. The other path is that there is something inherent about the servant. That words are, although they understand, the words are not enough to prompt their motivation to learn. Because there's an inherent quality of servitude that they must be told rather than corrected by words. It is a lack of agency, a lack of will, perhaps. And while although I think that this is something that can be improved upon in a transformational sense, it is not to deny that these people do exist. And at various levels, who is to say that we are not among them in certain respects? We all fit as pieces within this stratified matrix of the human experience. But on the average, I think we can appreciate a certain population that will inevitably find themselves in more servile positions of life. And in interpreting it this way, approaching the servant, I don't think it's a bad thing to correct them with language and making sure that there is understanding on this level. But action and instruction, direct instruction, is likely what is being referred to on this path of reflection and interpretation. See you a man that is hasty in his words. There is more hope of a fool than of him. So this is a verse that we've seen before. In one way or another. So see you a man that is hasty in his words. There's an obvious negative connotation associated with haste. The idea being that if something is done too quickly, then there is something that is missed, something that is not attended to. And who among us have not experienced this? In fact, I was thinking about this earlier today. I find myself having to calm myself down if my mind is racing or if I feel too much anxiety and I begin to trip over my words and I don't know what's coming next. That's not the place that the mind should be in order to establish coherent thoughts and maintain coherent communication with somebody. There has to be time that is taken to think about what is being said and what is going to be said, even if the time it takes between thoughts can be painfully long. I think there is some merit, there's great merit, into taking the time to be attentive and to explain carefully the thoughts or the desires that one is having. There is more hope of a fool than of him. So another opportunity here to reflect on this character of the fool. The fool is somebody that I have spoken of many times. The fool has a place in all of our minds. The fool is a perennial character. A person who lacks a degree of certainty or seriousness. There is a sense of aloofness to his mind. The fool is somebody that cares not for the bigger picture. The fool is somebody that is flippant. They occupy the same stratified class of people that we see in the Proverbs: the fool, the wicked, and the evil. All three, I think, have a tendency to arrive at the same conclusion. The fool may go in many directions, much like the wicked. The wicked is, I think, a little bit more restrained, but by foolish actions it leads us many times to the end that the evil wish to bring about for all. And this is a place of absence, a place of confusion and general non-being for the sake of non-being. Now, the foolish person does this unknowingly, unwillingly, in a sense. It is by the lack of the understanding or of the vision of the broader image of things, the broader connectedness of things, the inability to see the chain and the links that might bring one to some poor conclusion or a foolish expression that leads to a poor outcome. There's more hope of a fool than of a person who does not properly attend to his words. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'm going to continue next time with verse 21. And the subsequent episode to this will likely be the last episode of chapter 29. And we have two more chapters, chapter 30 and 31. So until next time.